Well, thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. I would like to start. It's the sociologist in me. I am giving a talk tonight on the left and right, so I'm curious to take the temperature of the room if I could. And there'll be moments and pauses in the talk, perhaps, where feel free to just chime in, because I'll be showing some video clips. So hopefully they'll work. Everything will run smoothly. But if you're not clear on the labels, don't feel compelled. But if you feel you're on the liberal left end of the political spectrum, I anticipated this. Wanted to confirm it. Moderate? Okay, here. And then conservative right? Not even a token. Got somebody? You're pointing somebody else.
This baby over there.
All indications suggest. Okay, well that didn't match my expectations. We are living at a time of significant political polarization. I mean, it seems that we look around ourselves, people are aligning more and more in teams, certainly red and blue teams, calling each other out. If we look in the Twitter sphere, we're going to see it quite often, in social media, people unfriending because of political views. A lot of really collective antagonism that's manifesting itself, I think, in a significantly dangerous political moment. I mean, there's some good news out there, don't get me wrong, this isn't a gloom and doom talk, but from the point of view of collective trust, I think it's fair to say that there's been a substantial erosion, and political polarization really doesn't help the matter very much. Oftentimes, I think, we may be inclined to believe, and this harkens back to a comment Greg made earlier, that, well, it's all about social construction, it's all about what we learn. When we think about why people have the political views they have, why they polarize as sharply as they do, we often think to ourselves, oh, they could just turn off Fox News, just switch on some MSNBC. And I'm sure they say the same thing, right? Because just go to the trusted source of Fox, you'll see the light, right? So there's this kind of learning theory out there that people just get exposed to ideas, they absorb those ideas, and they take on those political beliefs. And part of my mission, I think, in this talk tonight is to really disabuse you of that kind of conceptualization. I'm not saying social influence doesn't matter, it does. Certainly social environment, particularly if you're ensconced only in one environment, only getting one kind of input, that certainly can matter. But in today's society with so many different choices, much more is going on in terms of the agent, the individuals drawing stimuli from their environment. So the argument I'm going to make tonight is that our political sensibilities are sensibilities. They're anchored in our temperament, in our psychology, and ultimately, in part, in our biology. And this is not a point of view that many people in my academic field tend to embrace. As Greg mentioned, in graduate school in sociology, we were constructionists, right? Anything really goes. We can construct any kind of social norm that we wish, really. And there's no kind of motive or biological anchor or predisposition that we're born with that has any significant implications for how our society is organized. Well, I'm going to try to make the case that, indeed, there are these biological predispositions. And they're operating not alone, but in tandem with a whole host of social, institutional, cultural, and technological changes that are exacerbating the problem. And we have some significant problems. I think climate change, frankly, is our most severe kind of existential threat, but we certainly have to worry about loose nuclear technology, militarism broadly, structural problems with capitalism in terms of long-range prospects for employment linked to mechanization. I mean, these are very, very serious structural issues that we simply don't talk about in the political sphere. And if we cannot, I know this sounds painfully touchy-feely, but if we cannot see eye to eye and really begin to understand each other and work toward collective solutions, it's, again, I don't mean apocalyptic, but I generally want to wake up pretty pessimistic. I'm sort of more emotionally driven to do what I do, but I'm intellectually pretty pessimistic that it will have this impact. I'm hoping I'm wrong about that. Okay, so this notion that we have biological predispositions, that there's temperament aspects to left and right, has a pedigree. It's not like this idea is fallen out of the sky, right? Here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter he wrote. The terms Whig and Tory belong to the natural as well as civil history. They denote the temper and constitution and mind of different individuals. This is Gilbert and Sullivan. I often think it's comical how nature always does contrive that every boy and every gal that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative type, I guess. That is how it's said? Okay. All people are born alike except Republicans and Democrats. I think Groucho Marx was on something. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell a story that's pretty much not my own. Only in the very end am I going to bring in my own research. I've been active in recent years discussing moral intuitions in academia and how they shape and ultimately distort scientific practice. So I will get to that, but most of the story I'm simply going to be shamelessly poaching from a wide array of literature, quite openly here. I don't fill the slides with lots of footnotes to clutter it. I'll show you the books that I've primarily drawn from. Just be aware that when I'm showing you tables and things of this sort, they're largely drawn from one of these 5 or 6 sources. So Hibbing and Predisposed, probably most centrally from Jonathan Haidt. I'm curious, anybody familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work? Okay, great. Yeah. Prius and Pickup came out, I think, this past year. Political scientists exploring kind of the cultural aspects of political polarization. This is an excellent book by the science journalist Chris Mooney, who captures a tremendous amount of the literature on science denial, particularly on the political right. John Jost is an excellent social psychologist who has written just a ton on cognitive differences between the left and right. And then finally, this is a really good political kind of narrative about affective polarization by the political scientist Liliana Mason. So just be aware those books are at the backdrop of a lot of what I'm talking about. Other disparate sources, but those are the main ones. Okay, so I had mentioned we are living in a time of political polarization. Now, most of that polarization, I would argue, is top-down. We see tremendous elite polarization. There's no question about it. But there are things on the ground happening as well. They're kind of naturally occurring for a variety of reasons. So we have naturally occurring processes interacting with elite interests, sharpening the social context that we see. Here's a congressional map in 1976. The white indicate actually competitive districts that one could win if you were a Democrat or Republican. The gray and black indicate those that are landslides by one party, so you really can't win them. So this is, 30 years later? And, I did search, and I failed, but I would love a map of 2018, because it is so much worse than this. I mean, it's vanishingly small, the number of actual districts that are competitive. So what's going on? Well, the journalist Bill Bishop wrote a book called The Big Sort, which I suppose I could have put in that list, and he talks about a natural process where people are gravitating toward people that think like them, and feel like them. So the red and blue state is real, but so are the red and blue communities. Like the obvious urban-rural split is real, and you find these differences along these lines as well. Of course, there's also active political processing, gerrymandering, which only exacerbates this problem more.
Is this taking the gerrymandering out of the districts?
I don't think it is. No, it's including it, yeah. Okay, that didn't go forward. There it goes. So this is a table that I got from Nate Silver's page, discussing how the blue and red don't mean Republican, Democrat. In this case, it just means the House and Senate, how they vote over time. And the basic idea would be if the correlation R were 1, it would mean they never agree on a vote. So if you know they're a Democrat, they vote one way. If you know they're a Republican, they vote the other way. Following the Civil War, highly polarized. You go down toward the Depression and World War II. You have a situation of everybody has to work together. We have a common enemy. So there's still correlation. It's not like they're voting the same. But by now we see it's almost getting to like perfectly predictable. So if you know it's a Democrat, you know how they're going to vote. If you know it's a Republican, you know how they vote. You'll notice in political ads, some savvy politicians more or less say that. Vote whoever you want, but you're getting that agenda, and it's really true. If you're voting a Democrat, you're going to largely get that. If you're voting Republican, you get the opposite. Now that's on the political level. Here's mass public attitudes. Most people over time, from Carter to Obama, feel pretty good about their own party. That doesn't tend to change. This is kind of a warmth thermometer here on the left. What you'll start to notice, though, certainly from Clinton and Bush on, is it plummets. And I promise you, if we had Trump on there, it's going to fall to the floor. I mean, tremendously. This is something Liliana Mason calls affective polarization. It's not just that you're the group over there, it's that I actively dislike you. Okay? And so much so that if you look at survey data from the 60s to the present, and you ask people, oh yeah, it is worse. It's worse than race. More people are offended by the concept of their child marrying, say, a Democrat in certain regions than marrying someone of a different racial or ethnic identity. So it's very, very strong animosity toward it growing, larger and larger. Again, that's only 2010. It's very high. I wasn't able to get it in a table format, but I think it's somewhere around 70-80% versus maybe like 8% in the 60s. We're like, well, that's no big deal. Married a Republican and then married a Democrat. So there's something going on here. There's something in public attitudes. I think most of it's driven by elites, but there's all these structural and institutional forces and technological forces and media forces that are also exacerbating it.
Mark, when you say elites?
Political leaders. Political figures. Yeah. Thank you. I guess think tank people that would get a lot of public exposure also. Okay, so some of these were taken from the book Prius or Pickup. And so you're a mechanic, looked at these areas that are red and blue and found what kind of vehicles they're driving. Just to give you a flavor here. Now I have to say, in full disclosure, I do drive a Honda Fit, so
What's Kia Sorrento doing?
it is interesting. I don't have a good theory to support that. Okay, so this was a Facebook thing where they were counting likes based on political self-identification of music. So, yeah. I guess Bob Marley to George Strait does make sense, right? Focus in the middle. So again, I highlight these things to say that these cultural differences are real, but they don't have to take a pathological form. So the question is, well, what's going on to make these cultural differences so sharp and so significant politically? I don't know all these shows, but Modern Family. So the thicker the red is where they're watching these things. So I guess Duck Dynasty is pretty southern there. And Modern Family more on the coast. I think everybody watches The Walking Dead. All right, this was from Grubhub.
Oh, no way.
I absolutely love Chicken Tikka Masala, full disclosure there. Okay, I took this from a webpage under a talk by Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned, had a big impact on me. I'll certainly be discussing him in depth tonight. I added a few things too that I found as well. Probably the dominant explanation that I find among political scientists and other experts has to do with this party realignment. So the South, having been sort of the seat of the Democratic Party for a long time, once they turned towards civil rights, though, wasn't it Johnson who said we've lost the South? And then you have Nixon coming in with a rather conscious strategy to play upon those racial resentments, and law and order, of course. And so through a gradual process of decades, we see people with those sensibilities leaving the Democratic Party and shifting more and more to the Republican Party. And again, going back to that table on political polarization, a generation ago or so, you're going to have a lot of, conservative Democrats in the South. You're going to have a lot of liberal Republicans in the North, right? And we had something that Liliana Mason calls cross-cutting allegiances, right? We're interacting with each other that are from different political parties more. We're not as polarized on the ground as much, right? Mass sorting, as I mentioned earlier, the big sort into different communities. This adds to this problem, right? I think political elite strategy adds to it. I'll show a video a little bit later to that effect, where some are actually consciously, actively tapping into these cultural markers because they know they divide people. And if you can get people to act in terms of team and rather than policy, act in terms of emotion rather than rationality, you can win them over in the competitive struggle in the political sphere. I think media is a crucial part of it. Congress, of course, Gingrich was probably the classical illustration of this, just coming in ready to turn everything tribal. Stop eating lunch together. These are our enemies. We must fight them. Why does media matter? Well, media matters because, the phrase the olden days, but you watch CBS, ABC, NBC, you may not agree with it, but everybody watches the same thing. By the 90s, when we have cable news, we begin to see this split. Right? CNN may have begun it, but then when Fox came and then MSNBC, people go into their bubbles more and more, and this is only exacerbated more by social media. So you go into Facebook, you go into Twitter, you talk to your own tribe, you unfriend the people who don't agree with you sometimes, and you just live in this kind of bubble. And I'm going to talk a little more about what I mean by bubble a little bit later. So you have all of these intersecting. It's really a long and complicated story. I hardly can claim expertise on all the different things that are touched on here. I find that end of the Cold War point rather interesting. You lose a common enemy, so you lack that ability to sort of at least rally around something to oppose. But I think all of these things, gerrymandering, of course, important, and the flows of immigration and so on, all of these are in the backdrop. And the argument I'm going to make is that these processes are interacting with our evolved human nature, our evolved moral emotions, that have always existed, but for all of these reasons are now taking more visibly polarized form. So, this is the most ridiculously brief overview of evolutionary biology you probably ever hear. We are groupy, we are cooperative, we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in small-scale societies. And in order to cooperate, we really had to suppress that just ruggedly self-interested part of human nature. And to do that, we had to develop moral systems, these practices and these identities. And ultimately, our brain was developing in tandem with this. We developed a prefrontal cortex, higher social emotions that could help not just suppress our own selfish instincts, but develop social practices like gossip and exile. And even if we had to, even killing someone who defied group norms. Sometimes evolutionary biologists refer to this as a process of auto-domestication as a species. To make a comparison, you can think about what humans did with dogs over thousands of years, kind of take the wolf out of them. Well, human beings sort of auto-domesticated by developing all of these group norms, and that have corollaries in our emotions. Okay, the traits that we have, our personality traits, and the emotions that we have, evolved through a process of natural selection and sexual selection, in large part because they're adaptive. That's why we're here right now, to have this conversation. So certain personalities and certain emotions simply worked. They worked in terms of your ability to survive. They worked in terms of your ability to reproduce within the particular context that we experienced for hundreds of thousands of years in these societies. Prehistoric or clan societies constructed sacred symbols. So the plants or animals around them, they perceived to embody a kind of spirit. When people came together around those symbols, like if you're the turtle clan or the wolf clan, they unleashed, I'm drawing now from the very famous sociologist Imre Durkheim, when people came around these symbols, they unleashed a kind of energy that he called collective effervescence. This shared energy brought people together tribally, fostered strong sense of togetherness, and a kind of us-them sort of dynamic. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, just maybe think of some intense contemporary sports events. You see a kind of residue of this tendency that we see in human nature. So this us-them is quite important. This tendency toward tribalism, even ethnocentrism, has an evolved aspect to it. It's a part of our human nature. It's anchored in our brain. It still exists within us. And this is important to the story. So, just if we think of physical traits, it sort of makes sense. Yeah, you're taller than me. You're wittier than I am. And we think, these sorts of traits. We can see how some people have different musical talents, right? But what about aspects of our personality? Well, it turns out when social scientists, especially psychologists, look at personality, they tend to focus on a number of traits. And now that there's been this just explosion in what's called political psychology or moral psychology, we find that they're finding average differences. And I have to stress this, so I put it in boldface and I italicized the word average. Women on average are taller than men, but there are many basketball-playing women that dwarf me, right? So it's extremely important to stress this, and I don't want you to lose sight of it, and certainly we can discuss it in Q&A later. On average, when psychologists look at certain traits, openness to experience is one that tends to be much, much more common among people who turn out to identify as liberal left. So what do you mean? 90% of you apparently, right? What does that mean? It means we're interested in things. You're interested in new ideas, you're interested in different kinds of food, different kinds of music. There's cognitive corollaries to this. Notice I write tolerance of ambiguity and cognitive closure here. People who are open to experience are much, much more likely to actually just enjoy cogitating. I think that's a word. Just like deep deliberative thinking, something that isn't painful. You kind of like to do it. I think specifically libertarians, I didn't ask about that. And those on the liberal left, how many would say libertarian? Okay, so fewer than I expected. Okay. But yeah, so they seem to be even more inclined to this sort of thing. Conservatives, on average, less oriented to this kind of openness to experience. On the flip side, though, there's another psychological trait that's a central one that psychologists study, which is called conscientiousness, or they call it conscientiousness. And it entails organization, I highlighted here, dependability, dutifulness, order, goal setting. These traits tend to be much, much more prevalent on the political right. There was a study, I'd mentioned John Jost earlier, but there was a study by he and his associates where they examined the dorm rooms of college students, as well as office spaces, but the college students ones drives the points home a little more clearly. So you're looking at number of college students that identify as liberal, and you're looking at those that identify as conservative, and I wonder if you can anticipate which rooms might be messier. And again, average differences, but you'll find more clutter, disorganization, more CDs, indicators that they've been traveling around the world, maybe airline tickets and things of this sort in the dorm rooms of liberals. In the dorm rooms of conservatives, you're more likely to find things that suggest some kind of order, right? Maybe it's a hamper for your clothes, maybe it's a calendar, right? They'll also find things like flags, things that indicate group identity. This is an important part of the story as well. So routines and practices that increase predictability serve an especially important psychological function for anyone who perceives a lot of danger in the world because they add order to a chaos-riven environment. It turns out that on the political right especially, there is an orientation to more fear and danger in the environment. Okay. In talking about political psychology, I forgot to make my disclaimer. It is inevitable. No one can talk about political psychology without audiences thinking, he's got an agenda, he's biased, he's going to talk bad about the other side. I'm inevitably going to do that on some level because we're all tribal. But I can just tell you, the last 5 or 6 years, I am really trying to divest myself of my bias as much as I can to just look at what the data suggests about this. I'm not trying to wave a flag. I'm going to take a position later that will be on the team of the liberal left for, I think, empirically important reasons. But that's different, I think, than a kind of just knee-jerk, emotive positionality. So what you see is that there appears to be a suite of traits linked to fear and survival that are more pronounced on the political right, that manifest in an orientation or keener affinity to hierarchy, stability, group identity, order, and control. Greater sensitivity to both threat and disgust in the environment, including the threatening and disruptive effects of perceived outwards. Now, from an evolutionary point of view, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, it's controversial within the field of anthropology, but many, many anthropologists do believe that in prehistory there was violence, if not antecedents of war. Struggles over scarce resources, a kind of coalitional process where people would battle against each other. Now, just logically speaking, if you have a group of people who are really willing to, going back to collective effervescence and group identity and your clan identity, if you're willing to really die for your clan, you're going to be a much stronger unit than that group over there that might have more cowardly people, more free riders in it, people less committed to the group. So this is something in biology called group selection, which we're curious, we can go into it a little bit later. It's controversial, but it makes sense. And there's a motto in evolutionary biology, which is that selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So if you're selfish within a group and you run away from the battle, and they all die, well, you get to live, and your genes might get passed on, right? So that can win in some contexts. But groups that have a lot of people that are altruistic are going to outcompete those. And it's why the human drama, why human personality entails a mix of these kinds of selfish and collectivist instincts in the first place. And there's individual differences. Some of us are going to have more of the selfish-oriented tendencies. Some of us are going to have the more groupish-oriented tendencies. And then, of course, we have life experience and nurture that interacts in complicated ways that we poorly understand. My short message would be that the innatist perspective is, I think, increasingly important. And as a sociologist, it's unusual for someone to affirm that. I'll try to defend it, though, in a little bit. Okay, so these, I didn't ask about this, how to get those YouTube videos.
I thought of it with our borders and people coming in.
There it is.
And we know
I
what
saw
we're
it for a
going to
second.
have. We're going to have problems.
Right there. Yeah.
We have to very, very carefully vet. We have to be smart. We have to be vigilant. So here it is, the snake. It's called the snake. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. His pretty colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. Poor thing, she cried, I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you. The border. Take me in, oh tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, oh tender woman, sighed the vicious snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a comforter of silk and laid him by her fireside with some honey and some milk. She hurried home from work that night, and as soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman, sighed that vicious snake. She clutched him to her bosom. You're so beautiful, she cried. But if I hadn't brought you in by now, oh heavens, you would have died. She stroked his pretty skin again and kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite. Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman.
Their hearing, they go through an appellate process. They go up to the Supreme Court of the United States if that's required. But in the state of Texas, if you come into our state and you kill one of our children, you kill a police officer, you are involved with another crime and you kill one of our citizens, you will face the ultimate justice in the state of Texas, and that is you will be executed.
What do you make of what do you make?
The intent of that was just to demonstrate the applause and the emotive reaction on those issues. There's one last one.
40 or 70-30, but one side doesn't get out and vote.
Well, on the
if you
issues,
look at,
yes.
Right, if you look at all
I'm
these
not talking about
issues,
votes, I'm talking about critical issues.
No, but even on those issues, 67% of people do not want to repeal Roe v. Wade.
What do you?
70% of people are pro a DACA solution. 60 to 70% of the people do not want a wall. Again and again, the problem is one side does not vote.
Or no,
and if you don't
no.
show up, the other side will.
Or no, they don't vote, or they don't even know about these issues or what side the person is on. I mean, Harley Davidson, this is your issue. Your whole life was saving jobs. Somehow Donald Trump has stolen your issue, but he's not really delivering. I mean, how does he keep the Harley Davidson people on his side when he's losing them jobs?
Well, he won't. The people will. Listen, the Harley Davidson people and the people in Michigan, the states that Hillary lost, they wanted to throw a Molotov cocktail into a system that had hurt them.
Right.
They are not Trump lovers, and Jennifer's right. They have to get out and vote. But this is the beauty and the genius of Trump, and why you have to step back for a second and admire him the way Patton admired Rommel. That Trump, when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it, and he is relentless.
Yes.
He's even though
Yes.
he did what he did this week with the children in the cages, but he's still going to have the internment camps. He's never going to give up on this. Never going to give up on the wall. They are never going to stop. And we never act like that on any of the things that we say we believe in. They are relentless.
Right.
They are motherfuckers to the core, and we are like, I'm somewhere over the rainbow. That's how we are. And we have got to stop.
He reminds me a lot of Dick Cheney. He's not as smart as Dick Cheney, but he's relentless.
So I was illustrating those little snippets, partly for entertainment value, but partly to sort of communicate these ideas. Now, if we take seriously how people act, and we try to put aside our own natural tribalism just for a minute, I think it's, whatever you might think of Trump, you might say, well, he doesn't really... Whatever you do think of Trump, some might, on some individual psychological, he doesn't really believe this, he's just animating his base. I happen to do feel he's tapping into his own moral emotions, but it's neither here nor there. The issue is, the moral emotions that are collective among his base are there. They are afraid. They do perceive fear in their environment. They do perceive threats from outsiders, and Trump's able to tap into that. So this notion that they want to organize, and this is something Michael Moore was sort of lamenting about his own tribe. And this is the flip side. And for those of you who do think I am trying to just narrowly take sides here, I'm certainly not. In my own experience studying political psychology, I actually learned to sort of appreciate the virtues on the other side, because they are. There are settings where group loyalty matters, where you're really going to stick together in your tribe really strongly and be decisive, right? And be certain, right? I think it's in Chris Mooney's book where he said, thank goodness it was Churchill and not Chamberlain. In that particular setting, as a leader, when you had to fight such a deadly enemy, that kind of moral sensibility is what we need. So this isn't some blanket endorsement of left principles because I happen to have those sensibilities at all. It's a naturalistic explanation of our differences. I have an agenda, which I'll be open about, because I think the tendencies on the right, on balance, are far more dangerous. And I'll try to sort of defend that. But believe it or not, I'm not doing it from a tribal position, waving the flag. I'm trying to do it as a social scientist. Okay, so why do I think there's biology in this, instead of just something that we learn? Remember, I'm pushing back against this notion, well, he was a kid, he learned all this by watching TV or something of that sort. Well, I think there's biological differences to these, biological differences or underpinnings to these psychological differences. And it turns out there's lots of data to suggest that conservatives live in a different world than liberals do. They're more fearful about the world around them than they do. John Hibbing, in the book Predisposed, he and his associates equip people with these eye tracker devices, and they put them before a computer screen. And they'll see images like someone eating worms. They'll see little puppies, and they call it aversive versus appetitive stimuli. They also have neutral stimuli, like a door or something like that. And what they find is that the self-identified conservatives will home in more quickly than the liberals do on both threatening and disgusting imagery. They just home in faster. Liberals do too, because we're all equipped by natural selection to be concerned about danger in our environment. Conservatives more so. And then they dwell longer. So, and these studies have been replicated. Now I know it may seem like a small potato, okay, people looking at a computer screen. But when you start looking at lots of different kinds of data sources, right, and you start noticing they all point in the same direction, it suggests a biological and inherited underpinning. There's been brain studies showing that if you look at the fear center and processes of the brain of which the amygdala play a role, the right amygdala among conservatives is larger than that, on average, than liberals. The anterior cingulate among liberals tends to be denser than among conservatives, and that part of the brain kind of processes impulses and puts a kind of check on them. Right? So again, any piece of data like this alone you might kind of dismiss, but when they tend to interact and reinforce each other. Twin studies, I gotta be honest, this was probably the thing that sort of pushed me over the edge in terms of where data has to, trump your intuitive understandings of the world. Twin studies are fascinating. I don't know how many people are familiar with them. Did some of you watch that Identical Strangers?
Yeah.
Just a few of you? Okay, that had some material in it that's consistent with what I'm about to say. But for physical traits and say physical height, it makes immediate intuitive sense. And what classical twin studies do is they look at identical twins who share all of their genes, and they compare them to fraternal twins who on average share half of their genes. So if I were to ask you height, you're going to expect the identical twin's brother to be, if not the exact same height, pretty close. And then you'll say, oh, well, the fraternal twins, probably close, but not so much. Well, and then your basic common sense is borne out by hundreds of thousands indeed. There was a meta-analysis carried out this last year. Since the 70s, there have been 14 million twin pairs. It's just an unfathomably large number for social science. Many, many, many studies over decades showing these differences. But the rub is, this includes pretty much every psychological trait, and even things that you would think would be purely something that you would learn. So your religiosity, your political beliefs are highly heritable. It doesn't mean there's a gene for, like, Democratic Party or something like that. But the emotions that lead people to gravitate together and end up identifying if later on in life as Democrats or contrary-wise as Republican do have corollaries in the way our brains are wired and do have underlying genetic components to them. Now, we're a long way scientifically in terms of the genome and trying to find where these genes would be located. The general consensus is that thousands and thousands of genes operate in complex ways in concert around small effects. It's extremely rare to find like a gene for anyway, for pretty much anything. A few things like Huntington's disease, things like this. But in the vast majority of cases, it's a much more complicated picture. But genetic influence seems clear. And the interesting thing about it, just to make clear the way the studies work, political values say fundamentalism is where the secular house is a good one. Fundamentalism, people end up being fundamentalist. Well, identical twins fundamentalist is very likely to be closer in fundamentalism to his twin than if you have fraternal twins. Remarkably, though, there's no statistical difference if they're reared apart. So even when they found thousands now, even in the US they have studies from out of Minnesota over since the 70s. So when the twins reared apart, they're just as likely to be fundamentalist. In other words, we're not born blank slates. We're born with predispositions that nudge us towards certain stimuli in the environment. And in an interactive process that crystallizes into our social character, whether we come to define ourselves as fundamentalists, liberals, conservatives, radicals, will depend on the cultural resources available that we can draw upon as part of our self-identity. And that's why this is so complicated to talk about, because labels can be all over the place for historical reasons. I'm trying to look at the biological constants that undergird those labels. This is Reuters poll, and it's people who perceive this as highly threatening. And this, again, is the kind of information that suggests that the conservative orientation to the world is more triggered by fear and threat. So you just look at some of the data across the board practically there. So big differences on illegal immigration, Islam. And there's some where liberals do, or Democrats do, but climate change. I'm going to sound like I'm waving my tribal flag, but that really is a serious danger. Racism and things that we would expect. So lots of evidence suggesting biology, psychology, and culture, and ideology are all sort of interconnected.
Terrorism is more of a fear, and they're both really high.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know enough about, and I have to have done better homework in knowing exactly when it was, what the sample was, to get it sort of better. It might have been a regional bias, temporal, conjunctural bias to it. I was just trying to make the more simpler point about, in general, the right's more fear attentive. Now we're moving to sort of the heart of the matter in terms of the core framework. If I draw from any of these authors more substantially, it's from Jonathan Haidt and his work, The Righteous Mind. He and his associates have been doing tens of thousands of surveys online. Has anybody taken it, the Your Morals? Well, it turns out that, and I mentioned earlier, that our personality traits and our emotions evolved for a long period of time because they were adaptive. They allowed us to survive and reproduce. Well, moral emotions work that way too. And according to Haidt and associates, they would be heritable as well. And just like other, if you think of like physical traits, it's easier, this person's got red hair or something like that. Think of these tendencies and these triggers as being emotions that we're more likely to perceive in our environment that we happen to just inherit more of or less of. And that ends up leading us to filter ourselves into one or another political orientation. So it turns out liberals are pretty much uniformly attentive to triggers of harm. And so you have a stereotype about the bleeding heart liberal. I think it's largely true. It's largely true. It's this suffering, this concern for vulnerable groups, concern for the polar bear, right? My brother may be upset as I keep mentioning him, but he's on the opposite end of the spectrum of me, and he'll sometimes make fun of me, especially when we were younger. He'd be like, I feel your pain, bro. And that's how he talks, too. He's a big sports guy on the opposite. I feel your pain. Because he knows how sensitive I am, right? So harm and concern for the vulnerable. I don't say this to wave a flag that I'm superior or the left superior. That's just a empirical regularity behind that stereotype. So the fairness, it turns out fairness is, this table isn't quite accurate because conservatives have their own sense of fairness. It's very important. It's just a kind of different spin. Liberals care a lot about fairness, but generally linked to vulnerable groups. Got to be fair and make sure everybody gets a chance. Even if you're really bad, you still get a trophy. Got to be fair to everyone. That sort of sensibility is much, much more pronounced on the left. Matter of fact, Haidt says those are the two dimensions. And that's it. and that liberals simply don't inherit the underlying moral intuitions. I really should use this little, is that top little red one, that light?
That's the top one,
Yeah. So conservatives inherit these two, but not as intensely as liberals do. They inherit these three things that liberals don't inherit as much of. And I have to say as much of, and I have to say average. Think of radio dials, where liberals are just ramped up on care and a certain kind of fairness that's linked to justice. Notice social justice is always part of the left discourse, right? Conservatives, going back to our prehistory example here, in-group loyalty. They inherited a healthier dose of what triggers that sense of unity. Like which group tends to rally around the flag and rally around the tribe? Conservatives do. I remember I was at we were making signs when I used to teach at New Mexico State. I was part of an activist group, a pro-immigrant activist group, and we were making signs in a church. And just by coincidence, one of the church folks said, I have a friend of mine who has this Minuteman friend with him. Would you like to talk to him? You guys know the Minutemen, policing the border? So I said, sure, all right. And we thought it'd be a kind of an interesting thing culturally. And so he walks in, and he's not in what I guess he perceived to be friendly company. But to his credit, he said, listen, I know you all aren't going to agree with me, so I just want to break the ice. And he goes, can we at least all agree right away that we live in an amazing country that's just incredible, and we're all proud to be Americans? And among the people, we're kind of, well. and I think he was really saying it in good faith. Like he said, can we at least agree on that? And yet, he didn't really find a completely responsive audience for that. Because all of a sudden, we're doing our cogitating, well, vulnerable groups, lesbian, gay rights, yes, militarism, no, right? These things where we're doing a tally. It's not that gut tribal sensibility. Matter of fact, people on the liberal end tend to be much, much more cosmopolitan, universalistic than people on the right. The right tends to emphasize like American exceptionalism. God bless America, and then the liberal bumper sticker, God bless all countries, no exceptions. So respect for authority. This is also one that hard time for me. It's been the hardest one for me to grasp viscerally. I intellectually understand it, but viscerally I don't relate to it. People on the left, we don't tend to like hierarchy. We're suspicious of it. We're suspicious certainly of the bully who's going to come down hard on people. Right? But if you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, those groups that are coalescing or organizing together to fight against another group, they're not deliberating over that. They got to organize around top dog, top-down leader, and charge forward. It was like, stay the course was George Bush's motto for the Iraq War, right? You just got to go forward. You don't want to cut and run. You've got to keep in the battle, right? So that kind of respect for authority benefits people who have it from an adaptive point of view because you're gaining the protection of those above you, but you're also gaining the respect of those below you. And a hierarchy at that stage of human evolution is necessary, right? For groups to be able to survive in conditions that were much different than how we have today. And then finally, purity and sanctity. He talks about this as originally anchored in the need to avoid pathogens. So if you're in a prehistoric society and you approach like rotten meat, it's a good idea to stay away from it and develop a disgust reflex, right? Well, it turns out that tendency is more pronounced among the political right. You think about why attitudes toward lesbian, gay people. I remember I was at a party once where this elderly woman, she was in her 80s, was talking to me, and she said, I really want to be pro, marriage and everything, but I can't. I actually admired her because she was open and she was just evincing to me how it makes her disgusted. And that's just something that the liberal left, we don't really feel disgust about it, right? So it's, and it's more than just that rotten meat. It's also a kind of moral order, a sanctity to higher norms that can lead to social harmony. If you sacralize the body, notice that the right tends to sacralize chastity, and purity. And well, why could that be adaptive? Well, if people aren't trying to steal from each other their possessions or covet each other, if I put it in biblical terms, don't covet thy neighbor's wife or something, that's going to lead to social harmony. If you have norms that enforce that, we can see how these kinds of sanctity ideas existed in prehistory, and why couldn't they be anchored somewhere in complicated emotive matrix that we poorly understand, but apparently is activating us? Yeah.
I just disagree with that characterization of Jonathan Haidt, because first of all, there's a sixth liberty.
There is.
Yeah, there's liberty. But my reading of the book was that both conservatives and progressive liberals had a pretty constant harm, care, and fairness moral framework, and that the liberal progressives really had much less feel for those other four. So that downward, that's not how I read it.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is that it is the case that he does stress that conservatives feel care. I mean, there's evidence that conservatives, for example, give more to charity than liberals do. I mean, it turns out they're giving more to their church and their kind of tribal unit more. So he does stress that point. It's just when I look at the data, the numbers are still a little lower on the CARE Foundation for conservatives, at least my read of it. I don't know how much you want to get in the weeds on that. And I invite discussion on it. Because of the time, I'm going to rush through this more because I want to leave time for Q&A.
Take your time.
So, you want me to take my time?
Take your time.
Okay.
We're here.
Outstanding then. So I won't rush through these. These intuitions, according to Haidt and others, are anchored in our evolved biology. So why is it that we care? This is sort of the most self-evident question, but we love our children, right? Well, why do we feel that? Well, from an evolutionary point of view, if you love your children, you nurture them, they pass on your genes. Okay, so just by definition, you're protecting them from harm, right? Responsiveness to fairness. This is that fairness intuition, right? Why is it good to have this sensibility? Well, reciprocity has been found again, and again. There's been experiments about tit for tat in game theory. The basic idea is pretty simple. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We go back to prehistory again. Let's say you're at the hunt and your good friend is sick and wasn't able to go hunt with you. You bring home extra meat and say, oh, it's okay, you can have some. Of course you can have some for you and your family. But then when you're sick, your friend says, hey, sucker, thanks, good luck, I got my food. And you're somebody who's simply wired not to care, well, you're going to have a greater chance of dying. So developing tit-for-tat reciprocal tendencies is really, really important for our prehistoric adaptiveness. If you think about like Hollywood movies, I think it's like 80% of them are about revenge. Somebody's doing some injustice and you're righting the balance. Why are so many films doing this? Have they brainwashed us with this narrative and forced us through to develop these beliefs? No. I think they're tapping, and they're successful because they're tapping into an evolved emotion that's quite real. Group loyalty, again, I talked about it before. If you're competing for resources, it makes sense to develop that as a human tendency. Hierarchy makes sense, again, because of the respect of subordinates and the protection of superiors. And then again, this notion of pathogens and social harmony benefits when you have that kind of sensibility. These are some protest signs and other images that you think they're on the left or right? It was self-evident. Yeah, so we can feel and heal, we can break the walls. Right? It's so easy to laugh, so hard to hate. Let's be gentle and kind. Notice this on hierarchy, though. Like this, the nation's arguably the largest progressive magazine in the country. Insubordination. I'm going to go against the establishment. I remember when I was in college as an undergrad, these people wear these buttons that said "subvert the dominant paradigm." Very arcane, but like you're anti-establishment, we're changing the ways. That's something that resonates with people that have inherited less of that authority. The knob's probably on zero for some people on the far left who are outright anti-authoritarian. Stop Americanism, I don't know if this is genuinely someone on the left, but it just seems like it would be, but where you're going against your group, in a sense, group identity. Obviously, embracing immigrants, welcoming difference, and that again connects to that psychological tendency of openness to experience. You're more trustful of stranger, you're more interested in different ways of life, right? You're welcoming it, psychologically oriented to welcome it. Certainly not the people that are roused by Trump talking about the snake as the immigrant, different kind of sensibility, right? So march for the meek and weary, tax the wealthy, fair and square, right? So we got to be fair. Why do we have to tax those rich people? Well, they're dominating us, and we don't like hierarchy, for one, and we need to protect the meek and the weary and the homeless. The only minority destroying America is the 1%, no ban, no wall. My favorite here is the little boy there. Trump needs to learn to be nice and kind. Very simple. Okay, so is this the left?
Shut up.
So again, what kind of emotions are being conveyed through these signs and these bumper stickers? Well, This is a kind of fairness, by the way, and it's one that doesn't resonate with the left much. The attentiveness, when I first read about free riders in grad school, I was like, what does that even mean, a free rider? And I had to sort of really study it, even understand what it means. So my intuitions weren't guided by that. But from a prehistoric point of view, it makes a lot of sense. People gotta, they gotta gather the food, they gotta join together in the hunt, and if you got people that are not pulling their weight, well, why couldn't we think about that as an emotive tendency that conservatives simply inherited more of? And they're more attentive to it. And keep in mind, each team, this is going back to the title of Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, each team knows they're righteous. Trump's followers, I think that one guy who was saying the poem was actually crying. It's like, yes, we gotta protect ourselves. It's like we're part of this group doing the right thing for America. These liberals who are dangerously naive. Our subject is all to threat. It can emote them in the same kind of righteous energy that we emote, especially when we're pitted against them and feeling a sense of superiority over them, right, as they do us. Does my American flag offend you? Well, this is the classic America, love it or leave it. Old glory, secure the border. Sometimes war is the answer. And again, another one of those calling out the free rider. Right? I'm afraid to even try the video. It's going to raise chaos, but I think we might. This is just the famous. How many people are familiar with the famous Wolf Blitzer interaction with Ron Paul? It's worth it.
I'm not going to spend $200 or $300 a month for health insurance because I'm healthy. I don't need it. But something terrible happens. All of a sudden, he needs it. Who's going to pay for if he goes into a coma, for example? Who pays for that?
In a society that you accept welfareism and socialism, he expects the government to take care of
What
him.
do you want?
But what he should do is whatever he wants to do and assume responsibility for himself. My advice to him would have a major medical policy, but not before.
But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have it, and he needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risks. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
But Congressman, are you saying the society should just let him die?
No. I practiced medicine before we had Medicaid in the early 1960s when I got out of medical school. I practiced it.
Yeah, I'm glad Brad had mentioned the Liberty Foundation. Right? Haidt initially had 5, and then he introduced the 6th. And Haidt's pretty clear that he's speculating about these things. He feels there's likely to be more intuitions that are involved. He just thinks these are the ones that are most salient in the public environment. But here you have a perfect example. The guy didn't get insurance. Everybody's got to pull their weight, And it's like it reminds me of the old Aesop fable, right? Isn't it the grasshopper or the squirrel? Something, right? Oh, grasshopper in the end. Okay, so you got to do it over the winter, or you're going to die, and it's justified. But notice, to even be able to have that mindset means your care foundation, just by definition, this is why I'm going to push back a little. Your care foundation just can't be as strong as it is on the left. On the left, it's so overriding. It's like, well, I don't care if he did that. He's going to die. And it's so strong. Yeah, do you want to say?
Well, I was just going to say, I think the care is in a smaller circle. I remember years ago, somebody from Texas made the comment to me, you take care of you and yours. So they cared about you
and
yours.
Yes.
Not on a more global level.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. It's making me think of like a hypothetical, if it was like a military setting, and someone who would otherwise have Ron Paul's view, but it's like a Marine is in this situation. They may be like, okay, we'll do it. So that kind of groupiness is much stronger. That sense of shared identity is much stronger. Yes?
It's a concept of where rights and responsibilities belong with each other, because normally you don't have rights without responsibilities.
Sure. That's right. And I think on the side of the left, it may not be as pronounced when it comes to these sorts of free rider type issues. Yeah.
I did some research recently, and I feel like this might even be a new phenomenon considering conservatives, because I feel back in the 80s and 90s even, there were conservative programs that actually helped out people in need, you know what I mean? But I think over the past 2 decades, there's been a polarizing that's like hardened their hearts to be just like, no, fuck no. Because didn't they create for On Wheels, Food on Wheels?
On Wheels.
Yeah, wasn't that a conservative project? And now they're like, no, screw that, pull that shit out. Like,
Yeah, I think there were times, what I would attribute to it is the social historical context. Much greater sense of group unity, and there's, again, the political scientists, the historians point to things like immigration flows, the actual processes on the ground. You're saying harden their hearts. It's being constructed. This is why social constructionism is not wrong. It just needs to be wed to evolved biology to get a full appreciation of what's going on. So yeah, my hunch would be even in the 50s, you're still going to have people that are still attuned. It's just the larger culture doesn't sort of permit. And this is one of the dangers, I'm going to sound partisan or tribal now, but this is one of the dangers now, is that these right-wing intuitions that, when they're sort of put on steroids, are extremely dangerous and they're being validated. I did not expect, I mean, call me naive, but I did not expect the sort of resurfacing of just overt racism. I really thought we were beyond, I mean, that just shocked me. So I hear you. I think the cultural setting matters. My hunch would still be, though, even then, you're going to find individual differences that map onto this. But they're going to, with history, they tend to change. The baselines change, but the differences are still there.
What about religious care? I mean, the religions care for everybody, and they're mostly conservative.
I think they do, but when they go out, they often won't they evangelize along their religious identity, and so they're bringing people into their tribe, and I think they're more oriented to their own. It's ultimately empirical, but I think that's the case.
Well, and it seems to me that rural versus urban is a big factor
Absolutely.
here. Having grown up in a small rural community, everybody in the community, for the most part, and they were very conservative, but they helped each other.
Right. Strong sense of...
You don't see that.
You don't. There's a strong kind of rugged individual. This is part of the conservative values that resonate with me now as I get a little older. It's like we need to feel a sense of stronger community, stronger group unity. Yes?
I was just going to say, with that shifting, I remember Bush talking about the 1,000 points of light, which Trump now makes fun of.
Right.
So just to see the difference within the conservative movement, how much it's shifted.
Yeah, no question about it. And I'm going to go ahead because there's a couple things that might interest you, and I want to make sure I reach them. Okay, so let me back up. This is so creepy that I want to set it up. That's the right word. Haidt has a number of vignettes in his book, and what he does is he gives these to the reader to help people understand that if moral foundations theory is accurate, these are deeply embedded in the brain, and we're not conscious of them. So these triggers on the left and right, we're just living and acting them. It's not like we're reflecting and then deciding to care about the polar bear, we're reflecting and deciding to be concerned about the free rider. It's just how we're equipped. So what they argue in moral psychology, if you can focus first on that top line, moral intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. So it's a model of human reasoning that's really about justifying what you want to believe to be true. So let's take a moment to read this together. If everybody can see it, you can just read it. Do you want me to read it aloud as well?
Go ahead and read it.
Yeah, I have to read it.
So Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? That really created some silence there. Awkward silence. Criminal.
It should not be criminal.
Oh, it shouldn't be criminal.
But it's disgusting.
It's disgusting. No, you hit the exact right word. The reason Haidt... Somebody else about it? Do you want to add? Fine with you?
None of my business.
Okay. Well, none of my business, fine with me. The reason Haidt uses this, and he has other vignettes as well, is to show that it hits you in the gut right away. Now, my hunch is that those who say it's fine with me are going to be people who are deliberating and going, well, no, they're harm foundation only, like no one's being hurt. But what Haidt finds is that's vanishingly small, very tiny number of people actually say it's okay. What people do is they tend to come up with some reason to say, well, there could be a pregnancy anyway, even with the birth control, or someone could have deformed baby. And you have to ask yourself, is that really their reason? Is it some intellectual understanding that a child's going to be born this way that's really their reason for opposing it? And Haidt's theory is no, it's not, that it's just that stimulus of that action immediately hits you in the gut. And then by the time you're deliberating over why it's right or wrong, you've already made up your mind in your gut. So let's translate this to the moral intuitions again. If you have harm and fairness in your gut, you're deeply in your brain, that is, right? And you have in-group loyalty, respect for authority, by the time you're encountering some kind of empirical claim in the environment, you already know. And my hunch, I think all of us have experienced, how many times have you experienced a situation where you're in an argument, just when you're younger, you're in an argument and you're realizing you're losing, but damn it, you're not letting it go. Yeah, you're in this far, and your ego's bound up in it, right? I think it's such a natural human trait to invest in these things in a tribal way. And then the question is, what's undergirding it? What emotions are undergirding it? For liberals, it's this harm, care, and fairness foundation. For conservatives, loyalty, respect for authority, indeed liberty, and certain kinds of domain sanctity. I should stress, these are averages. With sanctity and purity, you'll find liberal left tends to sacralize nature and treat it as very pure. So you're going to find complicated mixes. Not everybody. This isn't everybody fitting neatly into a box. Nobody is the exact, or a few people are going to be the exact endpoint. A lot of moderates potentially will be in the middle on these sensibilities. But it helps us understand that when people are arguing in the political sphere about something, are they really arguing about the facts? And if they're not arguing about the facts, it seems like they're rationalizing emotive differences. And then what do we do when we rationalize emotive differences? Well, what do we do when we try to win a debate? We get on the internet and find everything that proves our side. And psychologists call this motivated reasoning, right? Or confirmation bias. We just search for information. If I had somebody in this room right now, if there's down the street, there's an organization of, I don't know, a right-wing conservative group, and we invited one in, he reads Breitbart daily, I promise you, if I'd ask this person, crime committed by, he would say, an illegal immigrant, I would say undocumented immigrant. Crime committed by a legal immigrant, he would say, oh, absolutely higher, much higher than the average U.S. citizen. That's why we need to be safe and we need to get them out. And then I would say, how do you know that? Well, I'll give you, he'll have a webpage ready. So, and we do it on the left also. Now, this is the sort of tribal part of my presentation in a sense, because I think the evidence suggests that it's more the more consequential denial of truth and science denial is simply on the right. I mean, climate change is the most glaring example of that, right? Now, this does not mean, I'm going to skip this because I don't have time. I had one more video. This one's kind of important. Just 5 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. We have natural differences. We're sorting ourselves. All these political, historical things are going on. Elites are...
What do you think of Howard Dean's plans to raise taxes on families by $1,900 a year?
What do I think? Well, I think Howard Dean should take his tax hiking, government expanding, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times reading,
Piercing, Hollywood loving left-wing freak show back to Vermont, where it belongs.
Got it?
Club for Growth PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
That might play if we're not careful. Top right could do it too, right? Okay. There's a part here that I was saying that if there is going to be a partisan moment, it would be this in the talk, even though it's not my intention to just state this in a tribal way. We're looking at a cluster of people, maybe I will go back briefly. We're looking at a cluster of people that psychologists will call authoritarian. This is extreme in-group loyalty, extreme fear of the outsider, right? Where you unleash a submission to a dominant leader, it makes yourself feel safe, while in a rather punitive way, harming those that you see are harming us or threatening us, right? It turns out in the American National Election Survey, these 4 questions, which have nothing to do with politics, are highly predictive of whether you're lean authoritarian. And I think it's worth asking the group just to be curious. Like, if you were asked the question, although all of these things are important, you have to pick one or the other in terms of raising your children. Would you choose to instill independence or respect for elders?
Independence.
Okay, obedience or self-reliance?
Self-reliance.
Curiosity or good manners?
Curiosity.
Being considerate or well-behaved? I mean, all 4 of those answering, all of you mean you are all left liberal. I didn't have to do my little... And then the people that support Trump, all 4 are going to be the other way. So what is this? These have something to do with politics. It has to do with child raising. It's an orientation that's deeply emotive, linked to hierarchy, control. It's a dangerous world out there. We need to get together as a group, right? Oh, glory. Sometimes war is the answer. We've got to fight those people. These wishy-washy liberal snowflakes are endangering all of us, okay? These come from a authoritarianism scale. It's very well known in that niche research. There's a guy named Bob Altemeyer from Canada has written about it. My dissertation advisor, University of Kansas, used this recently in an article in Critical Sociology. Highly predictive, and this is more direct, of Trump. If you believe our country will be great if we honor the ways of our forefathers, do what the authorities tell us, and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything. What our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. So the authoritarian right feels safe with Trump. We feel, I'm confidently going to say this, I bet money on this, we all feel pretty scared with him.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's most empirically defensible. But first of all, a week and a half ago, he was on TV saying the world's scientists are denying climate change as a conspiracy to make money. You guys hear this? The oil companies are the richest in the world. They would love scientists to come forward and say we can continue to burn fossil fuels for profit. So it's just palpably irrational. And yet it's affirmed. And rather than waving our flag and calling them stupid, because that doesn't really get us anywhere besides just digging in our heels, we need to sort of begrudgingly come to understand that people who gravitate to that message have certain emotional needs, right? Doesn't mean we agree with them, we gotta fight them. But scientifically, I think it's important to understand them. Last point, in case you think I'm on a left-wing rant, my own work is the opposite. So my own work is about how my tribe of left liberal academics can be blinded, also in this polarized climate. We're all blinded by the fight, right? So what I do in my research, I've done 6 major surveys with colleagues of academic fields. Academia, particularly social science and humanities, is overwhelmingly left liberal. You guys heard the data on that, right? I'm rushing through this part of it, okay? I go to where the controversies are that are very sensitive in our field, and I ask sociologists, anthropologists, and economists and others where they stand on these controversies. We've asked about 220 questions. I'm just giving you very few here, just to highlight the idea. It's plausible that cultural factors play a role in the perpetuation of inner-city poverty among the black community. There was an old cultural poverty argument that was common in the 50s. It fell out of favor by the 60s because it was perceived as blaming the victim. So what we do, I don't have time to show you, we show a vignette which says there's consensus among sociologists that institutional discrimination, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, outright conscious bigotry, entrenched poverty itself, are all the major, overwhelming reason why we see such social problems, like violent crime, out-of-wedlock birth, and just entrenched poverty, why it perpetuates itself in the inner city. We provide a vignette. But we also say, is it plausible, though, that certain cultural practices could make a bad situation worse? And what happens for left liberals is like, I care about them, no way. Now, to their credit, even above half of even the radical ones agreed it's plausible. Of course, the word plausible sets the bar pretty low. I'm not necessarily saying it's true. But notice how the more you go to the right, the more plausible it is. And people on the far right believe it's all culture, right? On the far right, well, they're just lazy. They don't want to work. There's no institutional constraints on them. The far right engages in this idea that people have control, total agency over their lives.
But the real far right believes it's genetic.
Okay, right. Genetic inferiority, that's a good point. And we can talk about that. Solutions to inner city poverty include some responsibility among the black community to address the problems of violence and out-of-wedlock birth. This is agency. Radicals don't like that. Because then you're saying, well, why do they have responsibility? They've been screwed. It's white America that screwed them, and we got to help them. Again, we're nurturing toward this vulnerable group. We don't feel aversion or fear of them. We feel white guilt. Many do. And as you go up the political scale, you'll notice greater and greater degrees of receptivity to their responsibility. I threw professional caution to the wind and revisited the famous or infamous Larry Summers controversy. Anybody familiar with that? The guy from Harvard, the president, who at a gender conference raised the question, speaking about genetics or biology, raised the question. We provide the vignette briefly. We offer a vignette to the reader which says, there's a consensus among sociologists that socialization and discrimination are the large explanatory reasons why in the work world positions are not distributed equally by gender. In other words, we know that men occupy positions that tend to pay more, women are concentrated in lower paid jobs. There's also a huge disparity in STEM, where men are overrepresented. Right? So we provide that information, but then we ask, is it plausible, again, plausibility is a low bar, that there could be an evolved biological aspect leading to interests that could be interacting with discrimination and upbringing. Socialization is how you're taught to be a girl, you're taught to be a boy, to act, and what you learn to be interested in. turns out there's lots of data for this. There have been mountains of studies on interest inventories, asking people what they're interested in doing when they're getting into college, and you'll find that women on average are much more inclined than men on average to, I gotta hit the average word, to be interested in working with people. Men are more inclined than women are to be willing to work with things. On testing of children, girls tend to outperform boys on average on tests dealing with communication, with facial recognition, with writing, basically communication broadly. Boys tend to outperform girls on spatial rotation type tasks. If you think about like evolution and the roles men and women might have played, it kind of makes sense that there might be this average difference. There's this finding in social science, highly controversial. I'm going up for tenure this year, I must be insane. There's a highly controversial finding that among men, their math scores are polarized. They have the same mean as women, but there's more really dumb ones, and then prodigies, quite literally. So what happens is, if I ask the sociologist, is it plausible that this, if you have a knack for this talent, and you're among a rare number of people who really can become a physicist, I certainly couldn't be, maybe that interacts with these other things. Is that plausible? And I'm telling you, I don't have any examples here, but the comments, I mean, shame on you, where we're called white supremacists, I'm not exaggerating, sexist, just asking the question, even though I can send, not to self-promote, if you're curious in the paper, I will send it along to you, or maybe we can provide a link for it, I think on Chris's, on your podcast, Chris?
Yeah, I gotta get it up there.
Sensibly, you can probably do Sensibly Speaking, if you want to read the article on it, we bend over backwards in terms of how we frame these questions, and yet we still pique tremendous emotion and tremendous hostility. And let's go back to the left liberal intuition on this. If women are choosing to become daycare workers, that means some agency of theirs. It's not oppression, right? It's not just socialization. It's something that's part of them. From the point of view of left liberals who are deeply egalitarian, who do not like hierarchy and want equality, and don't want people to suffer, that ends up being policed out of it. It ends up being a kind of taboo idea. So I find it to be plausible. I've sort of shifted my perspective on this. Do you want me to end it there, or want me to hit on these last two immigration questions? Up to you all.
Let's hear it.
Hit them? Okay, it's plausible that calls to limit immigration sometimes reflect legitimate moral concerns for cultural unity and shared identity, and not solely economic anxiety or racism. So can people say, we don't need this many immigrants and not be racist? Or is it has to just be racism? Well, for sociologists, the comments they send are just like, no, it's racism. That's what it's scapegoating. You're feeling anxiety and you're just taking it out on it. Now, does that, on an immigrant, does that happen? Of course it happens. But the question is that the only thing that's happening? Could there be concerns about unity and cultural identity? We don't feel it on the left because we're open to experience, we trust the stranger, we're oriented to engage the world. But if you happen to have inherited more of that sense of the local, happy with my meat and potatoes, going back to Grubhub, and you're staying close to home and hearth, and you happen to have more distrust about that you might just be uncomfortable in an unconscious way, going back to the moral intuitions, uneasy around the different languages. And instead of us on the left going, you racist, maybe we just have to step back and say, okay, well, you have that fear, it makes evolutionary sense, how can we work together and compromise together and not demonize each other? And then finally, this one troubles me the most in terms of radicals. Immigration policy should be informed by research on its potentially disruptive effects on social cohesion. This is just like, can we at least inform policy by some data? You see what I'm getting at in immigration? And 28% of radicals, very few say we should. It's like, no, they know in their hearts that immigration is good, and it's not bad, and therefore we shouldn't inform our policy by it. About half the field on average. And again, you notice the political directionality. So I will stop it there. And I guess we'll open up questions. I'm going to turn the light on.
Yeah, let's hit the light.
Okay,
I'm interested in what you were saying about the conservatives' affinity for hierarchy and like the idea that the upper levels of hierarchy are supposed to provide like protection and security for the lower levels of the hierarchy that then give them like respect and admiration and whatever. And I feel like that's very sort of feudal European. But I don't like, how does that, it doesn't seem to translate into things like the example with like, oh, this guy doesn't have health insurance, he probably works at Walmart, and but
he's going to die now. Where are the upper levels of hierarchy taking care of him?
No, I think you're right.
Where does that disconnect?
No, you're absolutely right. And this is what Brad. This is why Brad's point was well taken. I did forget to say that mapping. I just took a picture from the internet, and that was the one I found. If I found one with 6, I would have used it. The sixth intuition that Haidt unpacks in his work and his colleagues is liberty. So you don't want, it's like the don't tread on me of the Tea Party. We don't want these people over us. So that kind of strong libertarian tendency, I think that's all about the free rider sensibility. So it's not that everybody on the right has to have that hierarchical tendency. It's more the conservative right, like the culturally conservative right, more than the libertarian right, who actually don't tend to have. A lot of them, and I don't mean to sound critical, a lot of libertarians in general tend to evince lower compassion, but they tend to be really smart, really systems thinkers. Some extreme right libertarians, there's a category called social dominance in psychology, where they really, it's not, in my worldview, I'm going to sound critical here, but it's really like, I want to win this. And we're in a, you ever see the Enron documentaries? You know, poor little grandma, she's going to suffer. That's sort of callous, and we're winning and we're the rich. Frankly, a bit of Trump. You know, we're we're going to sick of winning.
But then if the hierarchy isn't taking care of the people in it, what's the point of the hierarchy?
It's to protect us. Yeah, we have to think prehistoric. We need to organize into hierarchical situation. We need to protect ourselves from that danger. That means we need to build a wall. We need to send the troops down there. And again, fear is part of it. Disgust is part of it. You guys remember some of the media reports of some of the right-wing politicians saying they're bringing over tuberculosis? You know, these are real fears that are, from a rational point of view, it's totally ridiculous. But yet, again, this is about emotion. Yes.
I just wanted to comment off of what you were saying. For a lot of conservative folks, they want to choose which hierarchy they serve, like religion, for example. They want to turn to that hierarchy to support them, not the governmental hierarchy.
Well, I think it ultimately stems most on the right, or you are the hierarchy. Like, it's the individualism.
I think that's more libertarian. I think it's true. It's more on the libertarian right. The another wrinkle on this to add to is one could also say, well, wait a second. They're attacking Obama. They're not loving the government. What's going on there? And I think what's going on there is that, first of all, they're in a tribal competition against Democrats. And then so what they do is they tap into these tribal things. He's not really American. He's Kenyan. He's an outsider. He's illegitimate. He even plays around with terrorists. So if you can delegitimize it, then it's not sometimes they fight against illegitimate leaders, right? Yes.
I see the nature and nurture question throughout this, especially at the beginning, and it's very easy for me to see the role of fear and paranoia on the radical side. But how do you see that influencing the progressive and moderate position and actions?
I think we do see tendencies on the extreme left. They're getting a lot of attention. I mean, if this is not what you're getting at, let me know, and I can better address your question. But how many people have been following sort of a lot of the attention to social justice, quote-unquote, warrior culture?
Yeah.
So you see it in university campuses where people are being deplatformed and they're screaming and sometimes attacking people like Charles Murray and others. So you do see left-wing authoritarianism. Now, the leading expert, I mentioned his name earlier, Bob Altemeyer, who's been studying authoritarianism through mass surveys for decades, says that they're more or less the metaphor is the black swan. I mean, they do exist, but they're really rare. So they do exist, though, and they're strongly, and they end up engaging in very similar behaviors. That it's like a military style. When I went to the Left Forum meetings last summer in New York City. I teach at Seton Hall University in New Jersey, so I'm close by the city. And I go to this meeting, it's about left organizing, things like this, and I was waiting for a friend outside, and there was someone from one of those very far left groups. I think it was Socialist Workers' Party or one of them. And I'm a DSA, Democratic Socialist. People familiar with Michael Harrington type groups. I work within the Democratic Party, kind of visionary gradualism. That's kind of the way I see how change is most realistically going to happen. I was trying to strike conversation up, and right away, you're a traitor. You're part of the capitalist class. You know, the capitalist parties, he kept saying. And he was very hostile. And I was trying to be polite throughout. I see from my personality. And yet, even at the end, I was feeling very, very threatened. Because, again, it's moral purity. Toe the line. Stick with the hierarchy. America, 1-800-LEAVE if you don't like it here. You're not part of our moral group. We must expel you. Yeah.
I mean, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Somebody in the mic.
Sure, City Hall.
Jonathan, is it
It's
height
height,
or
it's height, yeah, it's height.
You're sure it's height?
100%.
Okay.
That I can
Because
say.
I've heard it different. Okay.
Yeah,
So
people say
Jonathan
it,
Haidt,
yeah.
Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's latest book, Calling of the American Mind, is making a very impassioned case that there's some super authoritarianism from the PC, and this is it's within the student bodies. You know, the students are actually, and my son experienced this at a very liberal arts college, you know, Carleton, where he was literally almost lynch mob, starting with Facebook for having the temerity to have some qualifying takes on some of these issues. So right now that kind of authoritarianism is real rampant in the student. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree. It definitely happens. My tendency on this, although I think, take this with a grain of salt, my own bias might be coming out and wanting me to see it this way. My tendency is to see it as fairly small, but that it serves a right-wing agenda to constantly harp on it. And I love Haidt to death, but he constantly critiques academia. And now my left-wing stripes are going to come out. It's like the right has every institution, right? They got the government, I guess the House is coming, but the military. All these institutions are dominant. The Supreme Court, the one institution that's overwhelmingly liberal. And I think we should critique left-wing authoritarianism. Of course we should. It doesn't serve our interest to deplatform these people. So yes, it does exist. I think to do a reasonable study, and I think even Haidt himself acknowledges, these are some pretty liberal left type, if not Ivy League, they're the elite liberal arts colleges where you see this most of the time. The Browns and the Wesleyans. These types of schools. Carleton, yeah, exactly.
So in the interview with Wolf Blitzer and was it Ron Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was asking, so what do we do about this person that's in a coma? And he said, Ron said, he didn't plan for the future. That's part of his responsibility to take care of himself. And then Wolf said, well, should we just let him die? And he said, no. At the end, Ron Paul said, well, no, we shouldn't.
I think. Well, he was definitely not saying the government is going to take care of it. He ends up talking. I guess I should have played it.
Well, no,
yeah, exactly. The church should take care of it. This goes back to 1,000 Points of Light. Hopefully, everybody will do it, but we're not going to mandate it. From a left point of view, the mandate's the rub. These people cannot be left to die, and we're not thrilled about it. But the government has to come in. I think this is where the.
Okay.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah. So I guess that was part of the interview I didn't see. I was going to say, from your research, how do you account for that sort of cognitive dissonance that he went through? Like, well, we're not going to do it as a society, but his parents or his wife or his church, which is a societal group, or just a smaller one, should do it. Have you seen that in your research, like something that accounts for that? Why is it always
I think it's not my own research, just my reading. I would just say it just makes sense from the point of view of compassion. Just because libertarian right is deeply attuned to free riders doesn't mean they're heartless. Lower on compassion doesn't mean zero compassion. It's not a psychopath.
So they're thinking somebody should take care of this person, just not me.
Right. I'm not going to be held by my tax money to a state. And again, they're concerned about liberty. They don't want the state coming down. Yeah. It's encroaching on them. Okay.
So two things are kind of rattling around in my brain. The first is a lot of the characteristics of let's say the right as individuals mirror trauma responses. So for PTSD or complex trauma, even when it comes to attachment theory and how people attach. So I'm wondering, if there's any way, and here's the other thing about PTSD, is that it does alter genes, and those genes are passed down through the generations. So they've done studies with Holocaust victims, and their progeny have the same markers of trauma in their genes. So that would be an interesting study if you could go back and see if certain groups through migration have been that turn more toward authoritarianism, have experienced trauma through their generations. Israel is a great example of that from a personal viewpoint. The second thing that's coming to mind along that thought pathway is if you look at, when we were looking at the map, and it was showing, you know, the demographics of high density urban cities, blue, less density, red. Well, those, if, you know, if you're out on a wagon, crossing terrain, you are more exposed to threat, and it is much safer to be amongst a group that it has very strong, we're going to do this, we're going to fight, we're going to whatever, right? When you're amongst a huge group in a city, if you scream and your neighbor hears you because they're 10 feet away with, you know, a thin wall between you in New York City or wherever, I don't know. I'm thinking also about environment and you know, demographics. So those are just two things that are coming to mind.
Very fair questions. There is a debate over what's generally called epigenetics going on. I wish I could claim complete competence in this, and I understand the basic argument. This idea that genes are switched on by environment. So one of the famous ones, I can't remember the author, shows that children born during wartime, deep scarcity, will have a greater tendency to be obese later. It's almost like they kick in this, like, I'm going to grab resources when I get older sort of thing. So trauma would certainly relate to this. There's a psychologist named Darcia Narvaez from Notre Dame that argued along the lines you're talking about, and that there may be a kind of psychological orientation linked to survivalism that might have some coincidence with political conservatism. What I see in the literature is I see the like the Steven Pinkers, the more innatist people, pretty dismissive of epigenetics. They feel it's much ado. I'm not saying I agree. I don't feel confident enough to appraise it. Whereas you see people like Narvaez and others more sympathetic to the idea, and notice that brings in more constructionism. Like, well, the environment can help shape. You know, and my take on it, it's probably going to be, there's a kind of diplomatic answer, but I think it's probably true. I still think there's going to be, on average, genetic differences that make not every baby the exact same in terms of the likelihood to experience these tendencies. But there may indeed be interactive processes, things going through the germline linked to trauma that might predispose them even more, that has, it's almost like a Lamarckian thing in evolution rather than a natural selection aspect.
Right. Well, specifically what I'm pointing to is with the trauma, well, there's many, but something that definitely jumped out was scanning the environment for threat. Right. And people who suffer from complex trauma and trauma, that's their modus operandi. So if you have whole groups that are doing this and they're self-selecting into a group to scan, and it's innate to them, to me there's a clear line between the two.
No, it makes sense. And I could envision a hypothetical scenario where we go into some kind of, not Walking Dead, but certainly some dystopic situation where the people that are too tender-hearted are going to die, and those people are actually going to survive and pass on their genes, the ones that are more oriented to, like, all the hierarchical values that they would need to do to survive.
Right here. So, most of your work seems to have been kind of connected to Jonathan Haidt's ideas, and so there's other people like I think of Dan Kahane, Yale, and his cultural cognition. All of this data I keep reading, it's all really focused on the U.S. And you kind of touched on, you know, the evolutionary aspect. Are there any other kinds of similar studies in other cultures? India, China, Japan. I mean, does this model really work that we can tease out the nature versus nurture, the social versus evolutionary aspects of this behavior, these tendencies?
Well, the twin study stuff is massive, and I should have put another book up there. I strongly recommend Robert Plomin, who wrote a book called Blueprint. And for somebody a little dense like me on some of these complicated biological matters, it's accessible. So he just talks about the history of twin studies. He's now in England, where most of these twin studies have been carried out. Like in Sweden, they do quite a bit because they have open registries. So in terms of finding a genetic component to a whole array of psychological tendencies, that has been largely international. Height surveys have drawn from international groups. So I think it has been. I think you're right. In full disclosure, my competence is more anchored in the U.S. literature as well. So I don't know if I could speak beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Greg's doing it, and I keep thinking I'm doing it.
No worries. I mean, I don't really need this mic.
Yeah, you do.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, what's ruminating in my brain right now is my absolute just frustration with our political climate right now. I don't even know where I consider myself in the spectrum of like liberal or far right or whatever, right or left. I am incredibly frustrated with both sides, and what I'm seeing more is just like this gearing up for like civil war. And I'm fairly young. I'm 28 years old, and amongst my peers, I do find a lot of authoritarian aspects who are on the left side that I'm thoroughly frustrated with. And just the theocracy that's coming from the right is also just as terrifying. And like, I guess my frustration is the reason I came here is to look for answers as far as like how do we mend like this othering or like this dehumanization that seem to be coming, and what is it about like the older generation of politics that's like failed to like teach like the youth right now? Like when I talk to my peers, they're very like, and I've talked to a lot. Like I've been in socialist meetings, like far right communist, far left communist meetings. I've just seen the whole spectrum as far as like potentially like engage for myself, and I'm just I just don't find any comfort. And I guess my biggest issues right now is just how we on the left, I think we really need to start being a bit more, have more conviction. And I think that's what's creating like the radical element or the radical like aspects in the left, is that so many promises have been made on the left side, whether it be economics, whether it be environment. And every time economic interest steps into play, we always fold to corporations, and it creates this absurd like distrust and anger and frustration. And I'm just, I don't want to, I mean, like this civil war aspect idea that's playing around in my head is scary to me and frustrating, because I have family on spectrums, you know what I mean? Like they're just huge. I come from poverty, and there's a lot of poor people like that. There's a lot I try to teach my more like affluent, like left, like liberal friends, in talking to people who are poor, who generally tend to be right through like trauma or whatever, you know what I mean? I don't know, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Okay, a couple just brief responses to that would be the first. I probably should have highlighted more that even though there is polarization on the ground, I think much more of it is the more visible elites. Even though you are starting to see more affective distrust of the other party, when it comes to actual policy matters, they're more moderates. People in the middle. Most people are in the middle. Just the media, the vocal leaders on each side get a lot of visibility, and then the media, we have a corporate-run media that makes money on eyeballs and attention, so that tribal nature gets tapped into, and it creates even a more depressing sense of conflict than there actually really is. There was a study done on tweets. Suffice to say, if a tweet says something to the effect of like, the red team's great, the blue team sucks, it'll get tweeted over and over again. But if a tweet says, there's complicated issues, we're going to balance these two, no. People yawn and they don't follow it, right? So our tribal nature and connection with these kind of larger structural things connected to the media lead us to the conclusion that there's really, most of us are in one camp or the other, and that's actually not just factually true. The second part I would make, I guess I'm not being brief, you had mentioned corporations. This sounds like a little bit of a standard line on the left, but I think it's true. We have structural problems in our economy. We have serious problems with sustainability with capitalism, the ones I mentioned earlier. And I find that it benefits, whether it's conscious Machiavellianism or not, among the elite structure. I find classic divide and conquer. Like that Club for Growth video of Howard Dean there is just an illustration of a larger strategy of tapping into people. Because if you can get people to like care that I eat arugula, and then it doesn't matter if we share the same policy. I'm voting against you. And there's an attitude of pure tribalism. I would say Trump embodies this. He has no policy position. It's just a distillation of we win, you lose. We have people now, and it's more on the right, I'll be guilty if I sound partisan, where it's, I don't care, I want to beat you. So I get so much gratification on beating you that I'm just going to, so you're right, that does exist out there. In terms of solutions, it sounds so pitifully weak. I like to think from an educated point of view. In my own personal life, I changed. My brother and I haven't had a fight in 8 years since I've read this stuff. I know when you know people are different, you can sort of understand where you're coming from. The short message would be never fight their facts with facts. Facts are not going to work. The reasons we're not getting along have nothing to do with the facts. It has to do with we're not sitting in a bar together, talking to each other like we did a generation ago. I said this on the podcast the other day with Chris. It's like, oh, Joe down the road, he's crazy, but I love him. He's got these crazy ideas, but he's a friend. We need more opportunities to be. actually, I was kind of hoping we'd have conservatives in the beginning. More opportunities to bring people together, to forge those cross-cutting alliances that aren't so anchored in this. And I think there's at least some conscious effort among political elites to divide us on these lines, and we have to be on guard about it.
I'm here. So first, thank you kind of for letting us to step aside from our opinion for a moment and kind of look into the science behind it. I had two quick questions. The first question was that based on your opinion, is it true that we've recently started benefiting from being ethnocentric, and for much of human history we've benefited more from tribalism for just the nature of it?
Can you say it one more time? 'Cause I see them as the same. You're saying ethnocentrism and tribalism, I would see as the same.
Yeah.
Our group's better than your group. What do you? I thought you were.
I was kind of trying to more focus on let's come together and benefit from this interaction, from the social exchange and whatnot. That's what I was kind of trying to get at. And the second question is, the more and more often I see a lot of people, with very conservative backgrounds, their children trying to come off as like, we don't want to follow this, ideology anymore, and they're trying to come to the left side more and more often. How would that kind of fall into this, the science behind it? That, they were born and raised in a very conservative family, but now they're in kind of the far left. I haven't seen very many cases of the other, situation, where someone is from the left family.
The classic is David Horowitz. He was this rabid left-wing guy. I say rabid because even when he was on the left, he was authoritarian. Very far right.
Yeah.
I didn't understand your first question, so I'm going to jump to the second. If you want to follow back with the first, it is complicated. We have evolved biological differences that render two children different. We're not blank slates when we're born. There's a cliche in behavioral genetics. If you're a parent who has one child, you're an environmentalist or a constructionist. If you have two children, you're an innatist. Because you're like, my kids are so different. There's no way, I'd run up the same way. So clearly genes do matter, and it does have an impact, but at the same time, culture is changing. All these things are going on technologically, socially, institutionally, historically, and we're auto-domesticating. I really believe we are. We're getting more and more nurture. I think to be even debating microaggressions, even if you think it's overblown or whatever, I mean, that's a huge advance if we're debating. I think some of the discourse policing is not a good idea. I think it's over the top. I agree with Jonathan Haidt on this. But to be debating, it's a marker that the goalpost is moving in terms of our core moral sensibilities going more and more toward care over time. So it's a complicated, multidimensional picture where I think you're right. The young, even the conservatives of today, I mean, I shouldn't say virtually no, but young people that are conservative, I think, are pro-gay, aren't they? I mean, I think that part of the...
And they also believe in climate change.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so things are happening on the ground that make me somewhat optimistic. I don't know if you want me to go to that first question or you.
We can talk about it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for this insight. I've learned so much this evening. So I've been working in ranked choice voting for the last year and a half. And part of what drew me to this event this evening was to understand more of the conservative mindset. Because, we fall into our own political siloing. And so this was very helpful for me to understand what is appealing to conservatives about this. Because I did go incognito to a conservative event, complete with glued on eyelashes. And I did drop some shibboleths of, don't you find that voters with, our values find we can't really say our preferences because we're worried about, the candidate we really don't like getting into office? Yes, I do feel that way. And so they understood the concept, they really liked it, but it's got the issue of having granola stink on it. It's mostly in progressive cities that right? It's granola stink. And so they're worried about the idea. So I'm getting some ideas of, how our outreach can be more effective to this. So thank you very much for the insights. So if you have more insights on what might appeal to conservatives about the concept, that would be great. And also, part of what I'm drawn to with the concept of the ranked choice voting is that it isn't my team versus your team. It's here's my first plan, and then here's my backup plan of my first plan. If there's no consensus, well, let's get to a consensus together. And that makes the people running for office have to reach out beyond just their silo and talk about the issues and not just that the other guy is bad. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to anything about that, like where are our areas of hope in this?
Yeah, I strongly support it too for the exact reasons you said, and I'm glad that you got some of the value from the talk tonight. I think if I were talking to a conservative on this kind of question, I would give examples that pose it in terms of things that frustrated them. So I would talk about, like, you know, if your candidate's going to lose against Obama and they don't want Obama to win, don't you want to have the opportunity to rank order it? You want to try to speak to things that's going to link to their interests and their emotions. So they care about their group, they care about their tribe, they care about it in good faith. This is the hardest thing for me to come to terms with. For the longest time I thought, well, they can't really feel this, so they must be in it for the money. They have to have some nefarious goal. You know, but I think the fundamental way to really reach people is to really don't agree with them, but at least respect them as human beings and begrudgingly understand that they're wired differently than you, and then try to look for the areas that you know will tap into their moral intuitions. That's what I would say, along the lines of loyalty, along the lines of hierarchy, and try to speak that kind of emotive language. I know it's vague, but I'm not as familiar enough with the issue to be more specific than that.
Okay.
But I'd love to learn from you.
I have friends on both left and right, and increasingly I find more and more difficult to be able to talk to them because they just shut any conversation down. Do you have any thoughts on how we can keep the dialogue open? Because not having any dialogue at all will lead to more tribalism, and like the gentleman was saying, would it end in a civil war then?
Yeah, we have to literally evaluate our human foibles, our own. Like, look in the mirror, and like warts and all. And like I know, I reflect back and think to myself, well, am I saying this because I really am fighting for this, or I love, this is a concept in evolutionary biology called virtue signaling. I love that I'm being this moral agent and my friends are looking up at me now. So be aware of our own vanity, be aware of our own human tendency to shore up these emotions because they make us feel good. That would be a really, really crucial part of it. Try to create, and my meta message is don't play the game the elites are doing to divide us. Don't harp on these cultural issues that play into their hands. I mean, this is part of this where this PC kind of policing is just, it's really hurting all of us. You know, if they dress a certain way or make fun of their food or whatever it is, we have to not do that. We have to create settings where we're genuinely interacting with each other, recognizing they emote differently than us, recognizing our own foibles. I think that's part of it. That's what happened with me. By the way, it's so hard. I happen to be so far on the left in terms of the accidents of my birth and upbringing that when I first started entertaining these ideas, I kid you not, I felt disgust and shame. I'm like, women could be biologically meaningfully different and psychological. It was so foreign to me. I was so conservative. You know what I mean? I didn't even like thinking about it. So I just had to force myself through this process. In the beginning, I said, pretend you believe in Thomas Sowell, and I was able to read him. And pretend he has something to say. Like, I knew he didn't in the beginning. So I know there's a weird answer, but it's sort of like, I know it was so hard for me to move my emotive space to get more receptive and to even actually start appreciating the virtues of people who are different. So I'm not super optimistic about it. But we have to start somewhere, and that's what I see myself doing in this research.
Right? So when you were talking about fairness, caring, and respect for authority, do we have any idea of sort of what informs the fairness of the caring? Is there any evidence to show that the more we learn scientifically or the more evidence that we gather, it changes our idea of fairness and caring? And then there's, just to touch on the authority, is there any evidence to show that when you have a high respect for authority that you sort of take on the view of that authority? So for instance, like with the Christian right, not liking homosexuals, it's because it's in the book. If the authority said, you know, gays are awesome, would that type, that person, that personality type, that respects authority, respect the authority's wishes in that sense? Is there any evidence to?
Yeah, I think what's going on, the more I read it, the more I think about it deeply, it's so primal and so emotive. It's never like, it's in this book, therefore I believe it. No. Many of the most fundamentalist people know far less about their own religion than atheists in this room. So it's not about knowledge, it's about this deep emotive connection. It's not so much only the leader, although that's part of it. You want to submit and you feel safe. It's a part of group identity. I mean, you think of like climate change, when very highly intelligent people, and this is in Chris Mooney's book, he talks about this, the more educated someone is who's conservative, the more they deny climate change. It's the opposite of like facts get you there, right? So what's going on? It's my team doesn't believe in it. My sacred leaders, so it's not just that they're leaders, but you sacralize the leader, your church especially, they don't believe it. It's almost a moral transgression to believe it. I'm like a New York Patriots fan, I don't know, enjoying a Giants game or something. It's like you can't do that. It's transgressing your group, right? So I think that's kind of the moral dynamic. That first part was interesting though, Paul. In terms of evidence of care, you said over time. I mean, it's making me think of Steven Pinker's book on Better Angels. Anybody read that?
Yeah.
Well, just tracing over time the kind of philosophical, Haidt talks about this too, the philosophical process. He looks at Enlightenment figures early on who started to say, well, why can't gay people enjoy the same thing? These kind of like reasons starting to choke against traditional emotive barriers. So just the span of history shows that thinking about these things in tandem with other things, it's not just our brains getting us there. There's conditions on the ground that make it possible too. So I think this idea of like science lets us know that people are wired differently and we need to understand that and begrudgingly appreciate it could just be part of this larger human narrative. I'm not super, like I don't know, teleology, like it's bending automatically to justice, as I guess MLK would say, right? But I am committed to trying to make it bend that way, and we have at least some reasonable historical grounds to think it will, so that's the hope.
I guess some of what you just said earlier, saying that you were sort of priming yourself to be open to
Yes.
those books, is sort of answers my question. It's like you're aware that you have these tendencies and biases, and being aware of it allows you to sort of...
That's exactly, yeah, I'm an N of one, but Haidt says he did it too, and lots of people I think getting influence. He's a popular guy.
Well, I've done the same thing.
You did the same thing.
With, I have had in the past, like a physical repulsion to like homosexuality, two men specifically being intimate. There was something about it that gave me discomfort. And so I just watched movies over and over again, like Brokeback Mountain or whatever, where homosexuals were openly being intimate with each other. And I was able to just get over it. Now I see it, and I'm like,
And
this is
people,
awesome.
and you're seeing the suffering, so you're
Yeah.
probably tapping into your other care foundation, other ones you can try to nurture.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, we're so complex as human beings. We have all of these tendencies. I'm not a genetic determinist, I'm not a biological determinist. I think we have some leeway on these things, but I know from personal experience it's not easy. It's not easy opening up a book by someone you consider repugnant. And now I've changed so much that I know my tribe so well, I'm kind of bored reading just left stuff. So I get more out of insights that I would not automatically sort of gravitate to.
You've made me very curious about whether there's any evidence that as people or tribes move up the hierarchy of needs, they tend to revert to their genetic predisposition.
I don't know how to answer that. Revert to their genetic predisposition. The hierarchy needs from Maslow as your self-actualization.
I'm talking primarily about hierarchy of needs, Maslow's, yes, and that there's that safety and security needs that breed of fear and of loss of paranoia and so forth. A lot of people never move up to. But if they do manage with the help of society to move upward, do they tend to become more their predetermined selves, caring and altruistic and so forth, that are sort of the liberal characters?
I have the weirdest way of answering.
Or the reverse.
Yeah, I have the weirdest way. I think I'm answering you because I still didn't quite grasp it. Am I alone? Or you guys did probably more than I did. See, I'm tired. Going back to this highly controversial debate about STEM, I remember when that was first raised, you look at countries of the world, like Sweden and places like this, where they spent decades trying to integrate STEM, and yet they find this bias by gender. And if anything, there's huge advantages. Women get scholarships and things if they go into it. So it's just in a setting, and this might indirectly answer, in a setting where there's no social pressures against you, whatever the natural tendencies might be are enabled to come to flourish. So you'll take some of the countries like India, say, where women are flocking into tech industries. Well, if you're really, really poor going down to the lower needs you have to meet, you're going to gravitate to make a living. It doesn't mean in an ideal circumstance that's something that you would gravitate toward. I don't indirectly answer you, but it seems related.
Just real quick with regards to climate change, I think that to get actual old guard Republicans and conservatives on board, you have to frame it in an economic sense. So how would you go about trying to convince them that
there's much more jobs to be created, much more
Well, that's, you just
wealth.
hit the nail on the head in your answer, actually. You're liberating me. It's got to be all about meeting our needs in terms of jobs, hard work.
Well, there's much more wealth to be created in the long run. As opposed
Too many of our citizens are not able to dedicate their productivity. You know, again, but going back to this point made earlier about like the liberals think on something, when elites are able to sort of anchor our cultural differences in political terms, it becomes harder. Once people have a triggered group that says, oh, that's liberal, green, Vermont idea, go back to your crazy Vermont, then it makes it even harder. So I agree with you. You've got to go on things like how it's going to benefit people economically. You've got to be aware of their moral intuitions.
when I come from liberated myself from the far conservative right, so I'm trying to turn back around and like have a conversation with old friends and family. Like, we want the same thing. I mean, these people care about the environment. They go hiking all the time and they love the natural world, but they don't grasp the concept that, well, yes, your actions that you do today affect the beauty of the hike that you'll get to see in 20 years.
As the parties are so polarized now, it's so hard to talk about any issue separated from everything else, because in the end, there's all these other issues, and they're all being culturally affiliated with politics, so it makes it really, really hard. Even if you win someone over in a bar through all the wonderful hiding intuitionist strategies, they still have so many other issues. And I sound so cynical, but there's part of it that kind of is. I'm really, really pessimistic where we are right now.
Well, my mind was changed.
Well, you give me some hope.
And I was convinced by evidence.
Was it anything you read that you remember?
Not that I remember specifically, but it was just the onslaught and me basically getting to the point, well, what if I'm wrong?
So I actually managed to convince a really conservative family member of mine, and I just want to point this out. And it was all framed through economics and self-reliance, which is like a big libertarian thing, which seems to be like an undercurrent that's kind of reaching into the Republican things. Like, so I was talking about like building like self-reliant ecological homes that generated its own electricity, generated its own like drinkable water, and he was just like, oh fuck yeah, like I don't know, he's just, and we got to have a conversation around that, and eventually he was like, that sounds really great, I want to invest in things like that.
Yeah, and this issue, the reason I think this is, and Greg and I were talking about this before the event, this is kind of a U.S. thing. Around the world, even the conservatives countries are pretty much, everyone knows climate change is happening, got to do something about it. So it's just these dominant countries that are disproportionately influencing and profiting. The two countries in the world that most deny climate change are China and the U.S. What a coincidence. So it is a U.S. It is a U.S. thing. Our economic interests are so anchored in it. We do have to talk in economic language. I'm not super optimistic, but I think you're right.
So listen, we're gonna have to wind down. I want to end with one last question, sort of a meta question for you, Mark.
Okay.
So given the fact that like humans are sort of pre-programmed to have these sort of different styles of understanding the world, like conservative, liberal brains.
With many in the middle, but go ahead.
Yeah, many in the middle, but this is sort of the spectrum. As we move forward to a more global society, more economic equality, but mechanization, AI, is this a problem for us? Is this a vestige of our prehistorical conditions that is now a problem for the future, that we have these? I mean, coming from the left, it just seems crazy irrational, some of the stuff coming from the right, and destructive moving forward. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I do agree. I would echo people like Eric Fromm and others that I've drawn from a lot of my graduate studies about articulate development far outstripping our moral and emotional development. We have these species tendencies that are deeply anchored, and we have structures of power that don't benefit from the kind of changes that we need to do to be able to be sustainable in this economic model. So I think it's a very, very difficult situation. We have to formulate the policies. We have to dedicate our energies and double energies. And I think the point about lower conscientiousness that Michael Moore lamented is true on the left. He talks about we got to get out of bed. We got to be activists. We got to really communicate these ideas. We got to network better. Organizations like Cultural Hub. We got to build more political power. It's going to be very slow, very difficult. The kinds of solutions are so difficult. Like climate change alone, to really deal with it, to fundamentally transform an economy toward alternative energy, threatens the profits, not just of the companies themselves. Because I don't like things like your greedy corporations. I'm more a structural thinker. there's lots of workers that depend on the energy economy also. So we're all deeply implicated in the very productive processes that need to be transformed. And we have a political system and a class that feels fear, one, and they're privileging, benefiting from the existing system, and will activate all of these tribal intuitions and make it, and they'll divide us at a lot of opportunities. I don't mean to sound so conspiratorial, but I do think part of it is somewhat conscious, to divide and conquer. So we need to be aware of it, we need to communicate, we need to build bridges, and we need to have these conversations. Just in terms of broader politics, I'm of a mixed mind. I know there's lots of good news. People like Steven Pinker, who I mentioned, sort of enlightenment now. There's lots of evidence of advance in terms of poverty and global malnutrition. There's declines in things like sexual assault. You wouldn't know that if you just went to like left-wing blogs and things, right? There's lots of good data out there that we should be happy about, but there are also these very deep structural contradictions in the nature of capitalism. You know, the mechanization, the AI that Greg just mentioned, threatens long-run employment. There's a gentleman named Andrew Yang running for president. Have you heard of his book on universal basic income? You know, so these kind of movements we have to try to build, part of it by making good arguments, and part of it by recognizing our moral intuitions. We're not going to reach the authoritarians, by the way. I honestly don't find it, and just as a strategic thing, a tremendously good idea to try to get the far, far, far right, because their punitiveness is so strong and their tribal identity is so strong. So we can meet the middle, though. And we shouldn't pretend we have all the answers either, so we've got to be humble about it. But we reach them, we build coalitions with people we can reach. Not super intellectually optimistic, but it's what we have to do.
Thank you very much, Mark.